Hello and welcome to Going Dark, an intellectual dark web podcast. I'm Scott.
I'm Jack.
And I'm Peter. Today we wanted to talk about the ideas of diversity and inclusion. In 2020, these are generally presented by society as universal goods, as in they're good things for everyone, and we should all aspire to it. Here we wanted to present potentially a more balanced perspective and explore some of the value of diversity along with the costs that it entails. So my first question for you, Scott and Jack, is what do you see as being the value of diversity? And then potentially what are some of the costs that come with having more diversity and being a more inclusive society?
Well, so in theory, if you have intellectual diversity, it keeps you from having groupthink. The idea that you have people that all don't think the exact same things. Like you have a room full of 10 people. Maybe you have 10 people on the board of a company and they come from different backgrounds. They have different views on things. Maybe they have different worldviews. And yeah, maybe they look a little different. But right now I'm talking about intellectual diversity, diversity of thought. That is generally a good thing because if everybody thinks the same, then you're just going to go down this one road. It's going to become a self-fulfilling prophecy. You're just going to go down that track and nothing's going to be able to stop you. No one's ever going to be able to say like, hey, actually, some people don't think this way. And that inevitably is going to bring you to a point where you're going to take something too far. Because if you have a room full of 10 people who all think the same thing, they're all just going to bounce off each other and give each other affirmations. Like, yeah, great idea. Yeah, let's do that because we all think the same fucking thing. So you're just going to keep going and going and going until you go off a cliff. If you have intellectual diversity, there's always going to be people bouncing off each other. And what they're going to do is they're going to say, okay, what are the worst parts of this person's idea, but also the best parts? Like take out all the good ones, keep that, get rid of all the bad stuff. And they're going to do that with each other. This is a, it's like the process of peer review, of consensus building, of discourse. You can only have that if people actually view things a little bit differently. And the kind of funny thing is, generally speaking, everyone views things at least a little bit differently, but some people pretend to think of things kind of on a script. Like wokeness is a script, for instance. And there's a right-wing equivalent of maybe like hyper-patriotism, jingoism, hyper-evangelical Christianity, where like you're just going to always have the same answer, like God is good, or like fucking, women and minorities are being oppressed. Although I said that in the redneck voice, but you know what I mean. It's like intellectual diversity, because you said diversity. Intellectual diversity, which unfortunately is not the kind of diversity that people are talking about when they say diversity and inclusion, is good. And it leads to better outcomes because people are, again, they're parsing out what are, in a room full of 10 people, let's take everyone's good ideas and identify them as good ideas. But then let's tell people, hey, you know what, that idea is a bad idea. Let's get rid of that one. If you're talking about diversity purely of, particularly when it has to do with traits that are purely physical. Because you could almost make the argument, okay, so diversity of religion does affect your worldview. So maybe that's a good thing. So maybe it is good, if you have a panel, maybe you have a Muslim, a Christian, and a Jew, especially if it has to do with theology, make it a more interesting panel, right, than just 3 Christians maybe. But if you're talking about just race and gender, you're talking about things that in theory, they don't necessarily change people's worldviews from the get-go. Like, yes, women generally are like more pro-choice than men, or like African American people might be generally more supportive of certain policies as it pertains to like, urban policing or economic infrastructure or whatever. But there are plenty of people who are black that don't have maybe the ideological viewpoint you would expect them to have. Same thing with women. It's like diversity's been bastardized to this point where it doesn't have anything to do with people's worldviews. It's always about essentially race, gender, and maybe sexuality. In terms of inclusion, it's always coupled with it because it's like we need to include everyone of every, what do they always say? They say race, religion, creed, sexual orientation, and gender identity. They've kind of added on. They never say political viewpoint, ever. You'll never hear like, we want a variety of political viewpoints from the director of diversity and inclusion at an academic institution. They'll never say that because they don't. Or maybe they'll pay lip service to it a little bit, but they don't actually want a Republican on their board or in their discussion group. So I guess I'm just going to start off by making that distinction between the diversity and inclusion of people based off of race, gender, various other things that don't necessarily say anything about how they actually think, and then actual diversity of thought and inclusion of people with diverse sets of thoughts.
So I think you brought up an interesting point there in terms of you get together a group of people with a diverse set of opinions so that you can get ultimately at the best one, right? And when you realize the best one, there are a lot of people who have potentially views or ideas or worldviews that are different than the one that becomes the best one. So in a sense, kind of this process of assembling together these ideas to realize the one that's best almost necessarily creates potentially an adversarial relationship, right? Because you are, if you are supporting an idea and your idea, quote unquote, loses, then the winning idea is potentially in opposition to your own idea. So I wonder is that necessarily the case in a lot of these groups that at least, or potentially value surface level diversity rather than ideological diversity? Because real diversity and sort of choosing a best path and a winner really gets at exclusion rather than inclusion, because ultimately a lot of bad, quote unquote, bad ideas are going to get excluded as the result of bringing together a diverse set of ideas in order to find the best one.
Well, so this gets to this idea, which is people say like never exclude. This goes as far back as when I was like in elementary school, which to put that into perspective, this would have been like the early 2000s when I was in elementary school. There were all these, they weren't really couched in like political messaging, but there were all these like videos they showed us and lessons they taught us about like never exclude, don't exclude people. Exclusion is bad. Like, oh, you're excluding this person, don't exclude them. And it's like, yeah, sometimes we would exclude a kid because he kind of sucked. Like, you know what I mean? Sometimes we'd exclude a kid because he wasn't fucking fun to hang out with. And it's like, there's this big emphasis on inclusion that goes all the way back to like childhood. And then eventually it kind of became this political thing where it's like, you need to include everyone of every background. And it's like, you can't do that. Like you can't build a society or even a social group or any kind of group without exclusion. And you can't build good ideas without excluding the bad ideas. And you can't build an effective society built on good ideas without kind of excluding people who will not stop advocating for the worst fucking ideas. So like,
in a sense, you're saying that you can't have a good society without excluding the bad people.
To a certain extent, yeah. I mean, to the extent that you exclude them to would vary depending on exactly what we're talking about, right? So like we exclude convicted felons from a number of institutions, including the institution of everyday life. They're in a fucking cell every day.
Yeah.
Like we exclude them from a number of freedoms and liberties that the rest of us enjoy. Now, the argument is that they did something that called for that exclusion. They committed a violent crime in most cases. And that's debatable. Like, to what extent should we exclude people? But then there's also like, I would take it so far as to say, if somebody has truly just horrific and terrible ideas. So one version would be like your white supremacist, like your KKK guy. He has horrible ideas. He wants to create an ethno-state. On the other hand, you have crazy, crazy woke people who want to create speech codes and say that you have to use certain pronouns or we'll throw you in the fucking gulag. And in my opinion, if you have those kinds of ideas, we shouldn't throw you in jail. I mean, that wouldn't be very IDW of me. But I do think there's a certain amount of social marginalization that needs to be done to any set of just inherently shitty anti-Western ideas, anti-liberal ideas.
And that's the unspoken truth with a lot of these people. They don't acknowledge that the most obvious fact is it's inherently exclusionary to be in a society, and to be in a society of different states and different groups. It's part of the way we live. Again, what's the tipping point between what's considered, a bad exclusion versus a good exclusion?
And maybe to pick up on that idea, I feel like when I was growing up, the emphasis was more on tolerance, where it was we should tolerate other groups, we should tolerate other ideas, rather than sort of this ham-fisted, heavy-handed idea now of diversity, which seems very different from potentially what was typical in society maybe 20, 30 years ago. And I wonder, in terms of the differences between forcing diversity and promoting tolerance, maybe that draws the line between, say, good exclusion and bad exclusion. Whereas if we're intolerant of others and seek to actively oppress them in a way, that's obviously a negative, right? And we don't want to, say, impose our will on others against their will. And so we should tolerate them. But at the same time, sort of forcing diversity, in a sense, this seems like it almost comes into conflict with, say, a freedom of association.
Yeah, I would think of tolerance as like the idea. Tolerance is the idea that two disparate groups that do intentionally exclude each other. So say you have a group of, let's just say Republicans and Democrats, liberals and conservatives. You have two disparate groups. They can tolerate each other by saying, okay, yeah, you're not allowed to be a Democrat unless you have these liberal views. You're not allowed to be a Republican unless you have these conservative views. There's a level of exclusion, right? But the tolerance comes in where they say we exclude each other, but we are able to live in and share the same spaces on a nominal level. In that, it's like we don't have to appreciate each other's existence so much as just, again, the idea is you're just tolerating it. You're saying, yeah, we're not gonna kiss and make up. You know what I mean? Like we're not gonna be best friends. And you could say the same thing about childhood friendships. It's like I had people that I went to high school with or whatever that they were not a part of my group and I wasn't a part of theirs, but they tolerated me. Like I never got bullied by the football team, for instance. I got bullied a little bit, but it wasn't by like football players. But I also wasn't in the jock cohort, right? I was excluded from that cohort, even though they hung out with all the prettiest girls. So maybe I kind of wanted to be a part of that cohort, right? So, but I was excluded because I wasn't cool enough. I didn't play sports and that made sense to me. It's not like I was baffled by it. But they'd certainly tolerated my existence. Like the quarterback of the football team was one of the nicest guys I knew. He'd always be like, hey, how's it going, man? So there's this, and same to me. It's like I would see him as someone who, yeah, he lives his life very differently than I do. He parties hard and plays football, and I was being a nerd and eating pizzas and drinking grape soda with my friends, like just being a jackass. But there's this respect and tolerance that exists between groups that may not have anything in common that go out of their way to exclude each other. Like if I'm throwing a party, the quarterback of the football team, his name was Brian. He wasn't invited because I didn't want to fucking hang out with him. We had nothing in common. And it was the same thing. Like he'd be like, yeah, right back at you. You can't come to my parties either. But if we were eating lunch next to each other or whatever, or like we were in class together, he'd be like, hey, how's it going? Like just perfectly civil tolerance.
So do you think the left in America has become less tolerant through their embrace of diversity and identity politics?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. I think that, well, there's an interesting, I remember reading something about how whichever group is currently winning the culture war always becomes the intolerant one. So like at one point, the moral majority, the right-wing side was winning the culture war, and they kind of became intolerant of like gays and atheists and various other groups, certainly of people who lived, a more promiscuous lifestyle, more sexually liberated, even of like gamers. Like the enemy of gamers in the early 21st century was not feminists and all them and SJWs. It was the moral majority. It was the Christian right who hated violent video games and said that they made people kill people, which is false. But yeah, I think that I definitely think that now you see the left, for at least a period, was just making waves in the culture war, just shifting us so far on so many issues, particularly as it pertains to identity politics, particularly as it pertains to the identities of transgender women, black, all the ones that are listed in what's his name, Charles Murray's new book, where each chapter is named after one of these different groups. But anyway, the left, I think, has absolutely gotten to this point where it's funny because they always talk about how they're so tolerant when they're saying that they're tolerant, namely of sexual liberation in women and also undocumented immigrants. There's this idea that they're tolerant of people immigrating to the country illegally, and then they're tolerant of people's choices as it pertains to gender identity and sexuality. But when it comes to people's worldviews, they're not tolerant at all. And that's become incredibly evident over the past few years. I mean, this is something people in the IDW have talked about again and again and again, is they're not tolerant at all. I mean, they're incredibly intolerant to the point where they are actively going into spaces where there is that sort of exclusionary border that is there on purpose, where there could be a mutual respect. So like the feminists could have just seen the gaming community and seen that it was a community full of sort of this politically incorrect sense of humor that's built around just how gamers have interacted since the dawn of time, because it's mostly, younger guys who have a certain sense of humor or whatever. They could have just seen that and been like, okay, we're not going to fuck with that. Like we're just not going to mess with it. But then they took that step around the time of Gamergate where it was like, we're going to go in and try to change this community, and slander it and do these terrible things. And I guess that's the telltale sign of when someone has become intolerant, as you were kind of saying before, is you go from excluding by saying, like I'm using the sort of feminist relationship with the gaming community, that feminists could say like, you know what, maybe you can't really be. Maybe they'd say like gamers aren't feminists, which is kind of a silly thing to say, but I like it's better than them going in and saying gaming has a politically incorrect undercurrent to it. Let's change it. Let's make it ours now. We're going to say that gaming has to be about feminism.
Yeah, there was that shift, I think, over time from mere tolerance to not just acceptance and understanding, but forced acceptance and understanding through obviously Bill C-16.
And forced celebration.
Forced
like
celebration.
You have to celebrate.
Yeah.
Fucking drag queen story hour. You guys seen this?
Yes.
So they have drag queens at like public libraries who read to the kids, and sometimes they dance and strip for the kids. And there's this horrifying video on like making the rounds on Twitter of this little girl. I know Ben Shapiro talked about it. You go to his Twitter feed if you want to look for it. This little girl, there's like this fucking drag queen like crawling towards her on her hands and knees, wearing like, booty shorts or whatever. And she like hugs the child, and it's really creepy. And all the fucking parents are clapping. I think it's like a birthday party or something. Like, so anyway, so my point is, we're not just asked to tolerate these things, like a man dressing up in drag. We're not just asked to tolerate the existence of transgender and drag queen and transvestite culture. We're asked to celebrate it. Like, we're not supposed to criticize the fact that this person's child birthday party for like a 6-year-old girl had a striptease by a transgender or transvestite person. Like, I'm not supposed to criticize that. I'm supposed to like clap and be like, yes, beautiful, wonderful. How great is that? Like, the forced celebration aspect.
But are people being forced there? I mean, you're not forced to go to the library, right? This birthday party, I'm guessing they chose to attend this. So, how children should be exposed to different ideas, we have limits in terms of...
I think the force comes in when someone would object. So if somebody at the library was like, oh, I don't think this is appropriate for children. I think we should maybe not do... And it clearly fucking isn't, by the way. Like it's very obvious, especially at the point where... Drag is an inherently sexual thing. Like it's a sexual thing. It's basically a parody of womanhood. I mean, it's making fun of women, particularly as it pertains to feminine sexual mystique. So it's an inherently sexual thing. And if somebody were to go to the library and be like, I think this is inappropriate, they'd say, oh, you're a bigot. Let's get you fired from your job. Like that's when I think that so it's like maybe they don't force you to take your kid to the library. But then again, it's like the library is a public space. Like it's a space where you kind of do have to take your kid, right? Like a good parent takes their kid to the fucking library and gets books for them. It's like, I think it is kind of bordering on forcefulness even to insert these woke things into public spaces, which are just sort of universally used and to a certain extent needed. Like at some point it's going to be like, if your kid's in the hospital for an extended period of time, instead of a clown that comes to cheer them up, it's going to be some fucking transvestite that dances for them. Like that's forceful because your kid's there because they're fucking sick. You know what I mean? Like it's...
But isn't that ultimately the parent's decision, though, right? You can just say, no, this is not appropriate for my child, right? Maybe the library employee can't say anything out of fear for their job, but like me as a parent, my kid would never go to that. Like it's just, it's so, like, when you're 18, go do whatever the fuck you want. But like until then,
I see that.
What happens when you're trying to take your kid fucking anywhere? Like,
yeah, but it's not anywhere.
The fact that it's at a public library kind of because public libraries are usually very like tame. Like it's like it's a fucking library. It's like the lamest thing, right? It's supposed to be completely vanilla. Like this is where I take my kids for the most wholesome. That's the word I'm looking for. Public libraries are wholesome. I went to story hours as a kid at public libraries. It's the most wholesome shit. They only read the books that were totally kid friendly. If a public library has drag queen story hour, I'm thinking it's getting to the point where it's so ubiquitous. Well, because they're teaching it in schools. You can't pull your kid out of school, not a public school. They're teaching in schools about the genderbread man and gender identity and how transsexuality is like it is the only way to think. Like wokeness has inserted itself into places where it's unavoidable.
Well, here's the part that I can come to some understanding with these people is tolerance is a good thing, but if it's the only thing, all that is a society of siloed communities who don't really understand each other, but just kind of tolerate their existence. A lot of these people, I think, genuinely want to move to an area where there's real understanding and compassion for people like this. And in this case, you might feel that this is not justified and it's actually a negative on society. But there are other cases where it may be a very an unjust situation. A person in a community that's struggling, police brutality, something that you can maybe say is more justified in defending. And in that case, I can see the idea of not just tolerating, but fully understanding and being compassionate with those people. But the irony of, again, is when you go about that, it should be voluntary and it should be through arts or, literature, education. Although, again, if we're teaching kids about trans issues, that is through the education system. But then again, there's this line of, is this real science? Is this something that kids should be taught? So...
See, I want to challenge the notion that tolerance is always a virtue. I think we should absolutely be intolerant of tons of shit. I think again, so the idea of tolerance is to say that you should be inclusive of all values. It's to say that to be universally tolerant is to be universally inclusive of everything in existence. This whole thing makes no sense. To say that you should tolerate everything and everything, we should always be tolerant.
Right.
It's to say that you should never be intolerant of anything. What about murder? Should we tolerate murder? Yeah. Should we tolerate rape? Obviously not. And you could bring it to, should we tolerate racism? Should we tolerate? And it's no. This blanket statement that is used so often of we need to be tolerant, we need to be tolerant, we need to be inclusive. Yeah. No, there are tons of horrible, horrible ideas and actions that exist, and frankly, terrible people behind them that should not be tolerated. If we were tolerant of everyone, we wouldn't put anyone in jail.
It's so ingrained in society that I say it often without even thinking about it. I'm it's good to be tolerant. It's good to be tolerant.
And I don't blame you for having it ingrained in your head because we've been hit over the fucking head with it for 25 years.
Yeah, I think I totally agree. Maybe a follow-up to that would be, do people even want diversity? In terms of, increasingly we see with the internet, lots of people, they just seek out others with the same ideas or the same interests or whatever else. And I wonder if, maybe we moved from advocating tolerance to forcing diversity because people didn't voluntarily want diversity. And now potentially there are groups that see that as a problem or as a mechanism to weaponize race and gender. But you can either take the sympathetic or the less sympathetic view of the whole movement. But I wonder, if people just don't want diversity, right? They just want to be surrounded by like-minded people, whether it's similar educational backgrounds, similar incomes, similar race, similar gender, similar, interests, whatever else. Then maybe what we're seeing is a reaction to that. In that, we have become more free, we have become potentially more tolerant, but that hasn't been, quote unquote, enough because it hasn't resulted in the type of potentially diversity that certain more socially engineering minded people would want to see, and that the voluntary hasn't been enough, and so we need to force it.
I think a major part of the problem is the lack of clarity on both sides, actually. People who don't want diversity and people who do want diversity. We speak very broadly about these things, just as I just did when I said I wanted, tolerance is a good thing. And Jordan Peterson always talks about a lack of precision in our speech. He says, be precise in your speech. And that's a great value and a great virtue to have. So when we talk about diversity, either inclusion or exclusion, what are we actually talking about? Are we talking about schools? Are we talking about churches? In what area in our lives do we want diversity, or do we want a more homogenous community? So I kind of pose that to you guys because right off the top of my head, growing up in a diverse school system was, I think, a good thing in a lot of cases. I got to meet interesting people from different communities. My friends were fairly diverse. It was a thing I'm grateful to have,
So I think like a lot of things, we end up in a situation of having competing virtues and needing to figure out how to choose among the competing virtues, right? Because, having a society that is, to be maybe somewhat imprecise in my speech, that's more inclusive, that allows more people to participate and live fulfilling lives. I think that everybody would agree that's a good thing. But at the same time, we have in the West, the value of, self-determination or freedom of association, where I'm just going to hang out with the people that I want to hang out with and form the groups that I want to form with admission criteria based on the criteria that I want to surround myself with people. But then on the other side, it seems like that liberal approach, we had that for decades, and it didn't produce that diversity. In fact, if anything, it created less diversity across a number of dimensions, whether it's political ideology of, people segregating themselves into like-minded cohorts of political groups geographically. And so it's almost been like the reverse where, we thought, okay, well, if everybody's just free, then we'll kind of all be more diverse and more inclusive. And yet it seems like the opposite has happened. And now potentially we're dealing with the consequences of that, where the freedom is now potentially under attack because it has led to consequences that, say, a certain number of people don't like.
Okay. Again, to be a little more precise, when you live in a large city, a cosmopolitan city, there's diversity inherent in that. You're going to get more diversity in a city than you are in other areas in the country, more rural areas, right? So you don't often think about it. You don't necessarily go out of your way to associate with a certain group of people. It can just sort of happen naturally over time. And when you live in a diverse area, let's say you're a nerd and you want to go to a comic convention, you're going to be drawn to whoever's, part of that interest. And you don't know what the makeup of those people are going to look like. They may end up looking like you, but it's kind of hard to tell. I'm sort of struggling even to talk about this because it's a strange topic. I don't often put a lot of thought into, who I associate other than they're respectful people. They live in dignity, they're hardworking.
Well, okay, but I want to ask you both. Okay. So think about the people you hang out with. You always have some key things in common with them. And I'll put it this way. Before, Peter, you said something about do people want diversity? And the answer is, for the most part, no. People want to have most of the core things that define them in common with their friends and the people they associate with voluntarily most closely. And I'll expand on that a little bit. Think about the people you hang out with and voluntarily associate with. And think about the following factors: hobbies and interests, socioeconomic class, race, gender, and that's probably a good place to start. Do you have any friends with whom you don't have any of those four things in common? A person of a different race, gender, socioeconomic class, and who shares very few of your hobbies and interests, if any. No. I bet you don't have any.
Zero.
You have any. Zero? So in other words, I think people like to have a friend who, so I can certainly have a friend who's he happens to be, let's say, a black guy, but he also likes video games and podcasts and politics. He happens to be a man. He's from the middle class like I am. So he's got 3 out of 4, right? So his experience is pretty much the same as mine for the most part. But if somebody has one or none of those things, and I think the big ones are, I don't know how much race really matters. I think it's mostly socioeconomic class, gender, and hobbies and interests. Let's take race out of the equation. I don't think it's that big of a deal. Definitely socioeconomic class is a big one.
Yeah.
If I hang out with somebody who is, because I grew up middle class, if somebody is very poor or very rich, I do struggle to relate to them on a lot of things. However, if they also were a male and had a lot of my hobbies and interests, I could probably have a pretty good conversation with them. But if I hung out with definitely Oh, so what have I got here? I got class, gender, and interests. If I hung out with like a woman who did not come from my socioeconomic background, who shared like some of my hobbies and interests, we would only talk about that one thing, right? And there'd still be some kind of disconnect. Because like men and women do think differently. You do think differently when you're poor versus when you're rich or middle class. It's like, so basically my whole point is people definitely like the idea of having someone who has like one or two things where they're different on, but they don't want to be around people where they have nothing in common. And that's where it's gotten to the point where like people want me to be willingly hanging out with fucking transgender lesbians who spend all day reading about critical race theory and have never played a video game in their life, which is like my main hobby. And it's like, I don't know what I'm supposed to fucking talk to you about. Like, no, I'm not going to hang out with people like that. It's not because I hate them. It's because neither of us would enjoy that interaction. Like it's just best for everyone.
Well, no, I don't think they even want you to hang out. That might be a nice invitation, right? Like, hey, come on, hang out.
But they do want me to celebrate and support
that's
and
the problem.
Overwhelmingly. But, even if, just the statement that I just made where I said, like, you know what? I don't know how much I would have in common with a transgender person. They think very differently than I do about things as it pertains to sexuality and gender. I would struggle to relate to someone on that level. To be frank, I do not have any transgender friends, to my knowledge. I don't. And I do think that there is... I don't like go out of my way to avoid transgender people, but there's definitely something behind that, right? Like so let's add fucking gender identity to that list. It's like you hang out with people. Honestly, most of our friends are probably, be honest, guys. Most of your friends are white men who share your hobbies and interests and came from, roughly speaking, the middle class, right? Most of them. I'm not saying you don't have any friends who are black or women or anything. I'm just saying that like 80%, let's say.
I would say,
friends,
generally
80% plus come from a group that is almost identical to you in the core groups.
Even like one of my best friends was rich kind of growing up, and my other friend was borderline lower middle class poor. But we went to the same schools and we were in the same communities. We had the same conversations with the same people we knew.
So you had a bunch of other stuff in common. Because that's what I'm saying is like you could have one or two things. People like that. That's good. Like I think people appreciate having one friend who's more on the poor side or the rich side or he happens to be black as you a woman or maybe even have a fucking transgender friend. I don't know. But then you have to have a bunch of other stuff in common. It's like it's the notion that like people are like, oh, we love diversity. We want to have fucking nothing in common. Like we just want to be completely different people who hang out for no fucking reason. It so doesn't make any sense. This idea that like diversity is our strength. I'm like, is it? Is it strength to have nothing in common with your neighbor? Like if my neighbor was some fucking transvestite who just has drag shows all day, like that's their hobby. Yeah. It's like I can't relate to this human. Like they live their life so differently than I do. Like because I have no interest in drag shows. I don't even understand how they're entertaining. I don't get it.
And there's so much research on social cohesion and the homogeneity of community, right? Jonathan Haidt talks about this in his book, The Righteous Mind, and how conservative communities tend to be a lot stronger in their social ties and social bonds because they have religion and school and a lot of things in common and loyalty and authority and the respect for these values that it binds them together. And there's nothing wrong with that inherently. Right?
Like I said, I think a lot of this comes down to competing virtues, right? And I think the other side would say, well, by excluding, you are preventing all of these other people from having a good life. To pick up on what Scott was saying, I would add one more category, and this is like the third rail of modern society, but let's go there. I'd say IQ. And I think there are more so than socioeconomic status, because I think there are people in socioeconomic statuses that I can very closely relate to, even if they differ very wildly across some of these other dimensions. And I think it's, and Jordan Peterson talks about this, and he certainly catches some flack for making statements about it. But really, it's like your socioeconomic status is, at least if not entirely determined, but largely determined by cognitive capacity. Just in the modern service economy, there are just a lot of jobs that if you don't have a certain IQ, you will not be able to succeed at.
That might be the biggest one, actually, because now that I think about it, like as far as I understand, my IQ is like slightly above average. I'm a I like to think of myself as a smart guy, not a genius by any stretch of the imagination. I'm not launching any rockets to the moon, not a rocket scientist. Relatively smart guy. I hang out with people who seem to be in that same sort of intellectual cohort. I think I have some friends who are smarter than me, some friends who are maybe a little less smart than I am. But everyone's kind of in that. And the thing is, I would struggle. The person I would struggle most to have a conversation with is somebody who is way smarter than me. So like, let's take Eric Weinstein, for instance. That dude, he is so learned and on it and just knows so many things. I do struggle with the portal sometimes because it's so dense and the way he talks. I love some of it. Some of it I totally get. A lot of it goes way over my head. I probably wouldn't be a very good friend to Eric Weinstein because I would not understand a lot of the things he wants to talk about. By the same token, I would not do very well with a fucking moron as a friend. Like if I knew someone who was just fucking dumb, and I have interacted with stupid people before. I've had the displeasure of doing it at numerous points in my life. I can't be friends with them. That's a great addition, Peter, because I do think it's a major one. Is like people want to be around people, definitely, who are close to them in intelligence level. And I think everyone always says that dumb people think they're smart. I think everyone is much more aware of their intelligence level deep down than people let on. I think people who are a little lower on the intelligence scale or the IQ scale are pretty aware of it.
Well, I think it is potentially determined by your prospects at school, your prospects at in the job market. Like so much of our society is focused on, it's also like the whole Silicon Valley environment, right?
There's a reason why a rocket scientist isn't going to hang out with a sheet metal worker necessarily. You know what I mean? It's like the whole point in me sort of bringing up this factor of like people like to be around people like themselves is because I think that there's a critique going on of this very basic social phenomenon where people say like, oh, well, there's something wrong with that. If you want to be around people that have a similar IQ and similar interests and generally the same gender as you, like there are people who would criticize even the notion of like a guy's night or a girl's night. They would say, oh, well, that's fucked up. You shouldn't do that. And it's like, no, you want to be around people that have something in common with you. Like, and I think that is connected to this idea that like diversity, you must have maximum diversity at all times. And it's like, no, it actually makes things less fun to be around people with whom you have nothing in common. If I was hanging out with a stupid fucking person, somebody who's dumb, doesn't have any of my fucking interests, what the fuck are we going to talk about? I've had coworkers like this before. You know what I mean? Because your coworkers, you don't really choose. So like sometimes you find yourself working with someone where you try to have a conversation with them over lunch. You're just like, fuck, I got nothing. Like because maybe you're kind of smart and they're kind of stupid, or you just come from really different worlds. And it's like people would say like, oh, you need to make an effort to be friends with that person. That's what we were kind of told as kids. Is like make an effort to be friends with the dumb kid, even if you're smart. And it's like, I don't want to. We don't have anything to talk about. Like. We don't.
But I think this also gets into potentially some of the, let's say, if I'm to steelman the opposite position is that, so like we kind of came to the consensus on that people are, in terms of choosing their groups, IQ plays a very significant role in terms of who people interact with. And as our society becomes more technological, more technocratic, more essentially run by experts, in that I don't know how most of the things that I interact with in my day-to-day life actually work. Like I couldn't figure out how to make, an Android operating system. Couldn't figure out how to make a light bulb for that matter. And so I necessarily have to defer to people who know how to do that kind of thing. And in a sense, we are potentially at the mercy of the technocrats in a lot of avenues of our lives. And that potentially a lot of people who aren't in that sort of technocratic elite in Silicon Valley feel increasingly that they are powerless in their day-to-day lives. And so potentially lash out and see like, oh, well, it's like all these dudes in Silicon Valley making decisions. It's all the white guys and the Asian white supremacists or whatever they call them. Saying, oh, well, we need more opinions there. We need more diversity there. And we're trying to force it in because potentially they feel powerless in that they have no way of, say, competing or of having a voice in that sort of technocratic world.
So you're talking about sort of scale right? So, again, I think homogenous community is a good thing on a local scale. You grow up in a certain community, you want to belong, and you want to feel those social ties are strengthened. But on a scale where you're managing in one way or another, global communities, you're saying that maybe...
Well, I think what's happened in the year 2020 is there are about 10 cities in the world where all the smart people have gone to those cities. They make loads of money running really complex systems that, they shut down factories in the Midwest, pop them up in China, Mexico, Vietnam, wherever, and they kind of pull the strings with regards to how the world operates. And it's really, it's like 10 cities in the world in terms of where a lot of these decisions get made. And so a lot of people feel that they're left out. Like if you're not living in one of these sort of 10 global cities, it's like your job prospects are much lower. You're much more, your job is much less stable or safe. And so, potentially we see, with the nationalist Trump backlash against kind of those global perspectives. But I think also maybe more in Bernie Sanders, but certainly in kind of the more woke circles as well. They kind of look at corporate boards, and it's like, usually dudes, and usually it's like, 7 white dudes, 2 Indian dudes, and 1 Chinese dude, and they're making the decisions about shutting down economies in whole towns and rebuilding them somewhere else. So I think part of the impetus for pushing for diversity is to have a broader set of perspectives on these sort of teams of people that essentially run the world.
Got it. Okay. I mean, there is a case, if you look at certain nations like Japan, entirely homogenous, right? It's very difficult to immigrate to Japan, to be a citizen of Japan. There's a rigorous process, and I believe you even have to forego your citizenship of another country. Like South Korea, I believe there was a case where he basically had to renounce his citizenship there. And I think when we talk about Japan, the people and the leaders of that country are going to be Japanese. Diversity is not necessarily something you would even think about because they're Japanese people working for the Japanese people. Now, in terms of the divide between gender there, I can't speak to that. But I don't think inherently that's a bad thing. But if we're talking on a global scale with global organizations, then it's a little more complex.
Yeah. So to me, the irony or the thing that's illogical about this whole, we need a diversity in because I do understand, it took me a minute, Peter, but I kind of understand what you're getting at, which is that in the places where there's the highest concentration of power, like in the realm of the power players in the upper echelons of our society, where people are pulling the strings and making the big decisions, that people want there to be more diversity, so that, and in essence, this is how it's usually described, is why should white men be able to make all the most important decisions? Old white men in particular. And I think that the flaw there is, like, sometimes there's a reason why a particular institution is run by old white men, and it's because nobody else wants to be a fucking part of that institution. Like, how many people want to be Wall Street financiers that are not fucking white dudes? Like, some, yeah, there are probably some black kids and young women who want to grow up to be Wall Street financiers. Most don't. They don't. And I think that's to their credit, by the way. I'm not, I mean it as a compliment, because I don't know, I have a whole thing with Wall Street and people who are obsessed with financial manipulation. But anyway, it's like there's this idea that, like, basically it's like you take, I keep going back to gaming, but that's because that's like my main hobby. So you take like a video game company and say, like, let's look at the board of directors or the executive suite. It's all men. We need to get more women in there. And it's like, actually, men are the primary consumers and designers of games for a reason, of video games in particular, because they have always been the driving force in that industry. So it's like somebody would say something like, why aren't there more Somali immigrant congresswomen? And it's like, because there aren't a lot of Somali immigrants in the United States. And frankly, the ones that are here often have views that are inherently un-American. Like, in terms of, not Somali specifically, I mean like hardcore Islamists, which, as I understand it, I mean, I'm alluding to Ilhan Omar, obviously. She kind of is. It's like people would ask, like, why aren't there more Muslims in Congress? This is one that comes up. And this is that diversity, right? It's like, we need more people from a sort of minority group in this, what you were talking about, Peter, like a powerful group. Because one of the cities you're talking about is D.C., right? When you were saying, like, there's 10 cities that control the whole world, D.C. would presumably be in the top 10 or 20. Right. So, like, people would say, we need more minorities or women or whatever in D.C. And it's like, well, in some cases, you're going to have a lot of Muslim immigrants who, like, the reason that they might not want to be a part of Congress is because, like, they would read half the Constitution and want to throw it out. Like, they'd be like, we don't have freedom of speech in Saudi Arabia where I'm from or whatever. Like, they don't, you know what I mean? Like, there are people like, or like the same thing with the gaming company. It's like a lot of women it seems like a lot of feminist game designers, which has become this thing, they go into gaming, it seems like, with the sole purpose of, like, destroying the gaming industry. They're like, let's just constantly criticize video games and make them out to be gross and sexist. And also, I made a game about that, like a point-and-click adventure game. It's like this weird thing where we're asking for people to go into worlds where their sole purpose of being there would be to undermine it. It's weird. It's like, and I don't think it's always the case. I mean, I guess I think the argument that should be made is, like, you know what? There should be a diversity of thought in certain places. So, like, if you had a Congress that was basically unipartisan, or like not partisan at all, like you just had like one mega party, like say hypothetically Republicans or Democrats had like every seat in Congress, like it'd be like, okay, we need more intellectual diversity, we need people who think differently. But when people say, like, oh, we need more Muslims in Congress, we need more women in Congress, we need more black people in Congress, same thing about Wall Street, same thing about the entertainment industry, like we need more women on the board of the New York Times or whatever. It's like sometimes people aren't interested in those things, as Peterson has talked about, and a lot of people in the IDW have talked about. Sometimes people aren't interested in those things, and we're just trying to force it. Like, it's a thing that women might not be interested in, or minorities might not be interested in. Or sometimes it's like the values actually don't add up. Like, why like, women aren't as interested in engineering or video games, for instance. So why are we constantly saying we need more of them in that industry? It's like, you never hear, like, you don't really hear people saying we need more male teachers and nurses. And it's because men don't want to be teachers and nurses for the most part. And there's an understanding of that. So why doesn't it work the other way?
I guess they prefer to play video games. Is that the primary reason?
Yeah. I'm just saying that, like, there's this thing where people say, because you were kind of steel manning the pro-diversity argument, as like, people, they see that there's a concentration of power, and they say, oh, it makes me uncomfortable that all those people look the same. And it's like, yeah, but they might think differently. Like, for all you know, the board of, probably not Lehman Brothers, but let's go with, like, the New York Times, before they did shoehorn a bunch of women onto the board of the New York Times, and a bunch of, like, there's that Asian lady, Sarah Zhang, who's just awful. You know, they were just shoehorning women and minorities on there. For all you know, the 15 men or whatever that were on the board all thought very differently, but they happen to be white guys. And so now they're shoehorning on women who all look different but think the same. It's like you look at the New York Times editorial board, and there was a picture where it was like mostly women or something, or it was some newspaper, I forget which one. And they were like, what looks different about this? It was a tweet where it was like, what looks different about this editorial board? And it was like mostly women, and that was clearly the reference. And it's like, how many of those women do you think are registered Republicans or conservatives or independents? No, they're all progressive Democrats, right? It's like they all think the same way. It's not actual diversity. It's pointless. I think that's the main problem I have with the diversity inclusion stuff. It's like, I actually like the idea of saying that, let's say this, to get back to your point, Peter. I like the idea that if you have a very, very powerful institution, that the people at the top do think a little differently on key things, and that they bounce ideas off each other, and they're not just constantly affirming the same ideas until they take it to an extreme. Kind of brings us back to the first thing I said on today's show. But I want it to be intellectual diversity. There's no point in saying, like, oh, this board of 10 people, we have 2 black people and 2 women and 2. If they all think the same, you do not have diversity. You're actually worse off. You're better off having 15 white guys who all think differently. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. There was another thing that you mentioned a little earlier that I wanted to pick up on, because I think it fits really nicely with, like, a narrative that I was constructing. So, you know, as I was saying earlier, you know, potentially 20, 25 years ago, we more heard about tolerance and learned about tolerance. And perhaps we became too tolerant in a sense, and that we've become tolerant of rather extreme ideologies that are trying to force diversity, for example. And I specifically thought about this, when you said somebody would want to come here, they'd read the Constitution, they want to tear half of it up. And I wonder if that's increasingly happened in a lot of our institutions, and that there are people who entered these institutions as, say, the feminist game developers who came into the institution shouldn't have been tolerated in the first place because they are actually...
Because they hate gaming.
Because they hate gaming. And so they shouldn't have been tolerated in the first place. And yet, whether it was through diversity hires or quotas or whatever else, were sort of forced to be accepted, or even voluntary. Maybe the game companies thought it would be a good idea to tolerate this, and yet that seems to have been a mistake, right? In that if you tolerate ideas that will undermine your value of tolerance and make you intolerant, then the whole paradigm just implodes on itself, right?
It's this idea of saying that, like, you need to have a home that is welcoming to everyone, and you're like, okay, let's try this out. And then somebody rings your doorbell and is like, hey, I'm hungry, I need a place to stay. And you're like, yes, of course, this is a welcoming home, we tolerate everyone. And the first thing they do when they come inside is spit on the floor. You're gonna kick them the fuck out of your house because they don't respect your house or give a shit about you, and you can tell because they spat on your fucking floor as soon as they walked in. That's the thing with, like, the feminists in the gaming industry and the Islamists who are in Congress, which, by the way, I'm not saying every Muslim in Congress is like this. I'm talking about Islamists. It's like, people who hate America shouldn't be a part of the power structure in America. People who hate video games shouldn't be a part of the power structure in the gaming industry. People who hate cinema and art shouldn't be making decisions about what movies get produced and writing the scripts. Like, if you don't actually like these things, if you don't like politics and philosophy... I remember one time we were having a discussion and I mentioned something about people who take part in... who in theory are taking part in the political discourse, but they don't actually like discourse, and it's the woke supremacists. In that, what I meant when I said this was, you'll notice that they don't actually engage in any actual fucking debates. They just rely on ad hominem attacks and slander and all these various logical fallacies. And the reason they do it is because they don't actually like discourse, and yet they insist on being a part of the discourse. And it leads to these ridiculous situations where you have somebody who actually likes discourse, like a Sam Harris, and somebody who doesn't, like a Ben Affleck. And so you see what happens in that episode of Real Time when Ben Affleck goes after Sam Harris. You have one person who clearly doesn't belong in the discourse. The world of politics should not tolerate the dunce that is Ben Affleck. And so you have an inherently political, philosophical animal in Harris who has to deal with this asshole that doesn't belong in the same room as him. And thus you get exclusion. Exclude Ben Affleck from the fucking debate hall. He doesn't belong there.
I like what you said.
Because he doesn't even like debating.
I like what you said about respecting, like, the rules and the traditions of what institution you're in. When you hear the stories of people that have moved up in an organization, like a woman who, there's like a couple women in an organization, the way they've moved up is by respecting the rules and the traditions of that organization, even if they are maybe at times unjust or stupid or whatever, but they did what they had to do to get to the top. And when I say that, I don't mean in any, like, sexual way or anything like that. No, because that is now part of the conversation. But let's say that was not part of it. They rose to the top. They can start making decisions and shifting the culture in their own way. And maybe for the better, maybe for the worse. But you have to kind of pay your dues and understand where this place came from. And from, like, a zoom out perspective of the United States, this is like a major claim, but the reason a lot of these multinational corporations are run by men from the West is because the West boomed. It was the most successful economic experiment in the world history, right? And so primarily this is the United States and Western countries. And so you're going to see over the last 200 years, white men primarily running these institutions. And now there are a lot more women. So I think over time we'll see things shifting and changing, but it makes sense if you look at it historically why things look the way they do. So that's kind of my overall
Yeah, the idea is you should only let people into an institution and let them move up the ranks of that institution if they clearly want what's best for that institution and have an appreciation and respect for what makes it special, for what makes it important, for what makes the authority invested in them so vital in its being used appropriately and not being used to undermine that very institution. And what we're being asked to do in various institutions is let's let in people who hate that institution for the sole purpose of them undermining it. A good example is, why the hell are we letting these kids into colleges where all they want to do is shut the college down with some scandal? All they want to do is march into the president's office and be like, you're a racist and a sexist. Let's shut the whole thing down. Fuck those kids. College is awesome. And a lot of administrators work really hard to give a great experience to college students. And these ungrateful little pricks are just going to march in there and try and get the whole thing. They just want to create a PR crisis for their president because it's fun, because it makes them feel like a rebel. And it's like, no, those kids should get expelled. I'm not saying you should be expelled for a legitimate political protest, but if all you're doing is making up some complaint about some microaggression so that you can get a professor fired and read about it in the news and be like, look, I did that, you're undermining. You don't actually, the point is you don't even like your college. Clearly you hate it and you're trying to hurt it.
And that doesn't qualify as diversity of intellectual thought. So where would you draw that line, for example, between
right? No, that's a good question. It's a good question, and that's an excellent question. I alluded to that. So I guess you have to really think about what someone is objecting to, and if it's a valid objection, and they express it in a way where, so like, say for instance, you have a student who they genuinely believe that there's a policy that is unfair in like their professor's syllabus or something. So they go and here's the thing. They do it out of the view of the media. There's nothing that has to do with like getting attention, right? They do it in a private, they like go to the professor in a private meeting, or they go to the dean if they have to in a private meeting, and they say like, hey, I have an objection to a policy that I think will make this school a better place if we change it. And they're doing it clearly, right? So there's no attempt to like get the media's attention. There's not these big demonstrations, which are clearly meant to get the attention of the media. They're not taking cell phone videos from inside the president's office of them shouting, you're a racist, fuck you, we're going to get you fired. They're not doing that. They're not sending that into CNN. There's no attention getting aspect. So you can tell that you have a student who is calmly, the other thing is they're doing it calmly. You see them doing it calmly. You see them doing it in a way where they're explaining themselves very thoroughly, why they feel the way they feel. You can just tell that some people have good intentions. They may object to something. They may want to protest something. And I'm not saying we can't protest at your university. I'm not saying you can't protest an industry that you object to, whether it's the video game industry or the movie industry or Wall Street or whatever. I'm not saying you can't do that. It's when you're clearly doing it for personal gain or because you don't want to make the thing better, you want to destroy it. There's people who they criticize. It's the difference between constructive criticism and destructive slander and criticism is when somebody goes to an institution and calmly sort of proceeds in a way where they communicate an objection in such a manner where it's clear that they want to improve that institution. They want it to be better off because of an idea that they had or something that they want changed. Then there's the person who clearly is trying to just get people in trouble and get bad press associated with an institution, maybe a college, for instance, like the example I used before. And I think we need to parse out those two different groups because, yes, objection and protest is so important to constant improvement of our institutions. It's important to draw that line. It's vital. But we do need to learn to recognize the bad faith underminers, the people who have no intention but to destroy, to utterly level an institution that does do good things. And then the people who are genuinely trying to improve it. And you can actually say that for the whole country. There are people who, like, I object to a lot of things that we do in America. Believe me, I don't think America is a perfect country, but I don't want it fucking destroyed. I think woke supremacists generally just want to see the whole Western society just collapse. And they want it to be replaced with some kind of, maybe it's a communist utopia or whatever.
So that's actually kind of a scary thought in a lot of ways, and I'm potentially going to contradict what we said on the last episode, but we're here to explore ideas, so let's keep exploring. So in 2020, with Twitter, with social media, so one individual person on a college campus now has the whole Twitter woke army behind them. And it's so much easier to destroy something than it is to build something new. And so with sort of that power, that leverage that you gain from just widespread social media adoption, you can take down institutions, you can take down a college, you can trigger this kind of scale. You can do the same thing to corporations. And so I wonder if potentially a lot of these institutions have embraced wokeness in a sense because of the power with which a single individual who wants to act in bad faith can come down on a corporation that does not, abide by some really, really strict moral code.
It's appeasement.
Well, but I wouldn't necessarily. Well, it's appeasement, but it comes up from a place of fear potentially.
Yes, no, it's appeasement via fear, because what they find is somebody comes with a complaint and they're like, okay, so you're asking for this, and if we don't do this, it's going to get us a lot of bad press. Shit. Okay, but it's just a small thing. They just want there to be like a diversity officer in the HR department. Okay, whatever. Let's just do that, and then they'll fucking leave us alone. And then right, you give them a mousse a muffin or whatever, and like they just keep asking for more. Or is it you give a mouse a cookie? I think there's 2 books. Anyway, so like it's this appeasement strategy, and this is exactly how Hitler took countries in World War II. Is he would like the West, the Allied powers were like, well, if we just let him take a couple more countries, he'll like calm down, and then eventually it'll work itself out. No, he just kept taking more. He was like, Poland's mine, France is mine, Britain's gonna be mine. He was just taking shit. The woke supremacists do the same thing. I'm not saying they're completely the same as Hitler, but they are doing something similar in that they take something, and then these institutions are afraid of what'll happen if they don't let them take it. So instead of putting a stop to it right from the get-go and saying, you know what, we're not going to have a diversity officer. That's not necessary. Sorry. Go back to work. Instead, they're saying, okay, let's do that. And then, let's make the gender neutral restrooms, and let's change a couple other things. Let's fire James Damore because he's just being a rabble rouser, right? He's being unnecessary. Okay, let's fire everyone who's even a little like James Damore. Let's just fire everybody who's conservative. You know what I mean? Like it's little by little, there's this appeasement thing where these companies are afraid, as you said, of what woke supremacists will do, because just one of them can fuck up your day with a fucking video on Twitter where they selectively edit it and make it look like you're, being dismissive of them or whatever. And they have this whole Twitterati behind them. Exactly. And so they keep giving them these things little by little. But the thing is, you have to lay your foot down at the very start. Because once that thing gets rolling, where you're just giving more and more and more, it's so hard to stop. And these companies just keep going and going and going to the point where almost every institution that is not inherently anti-woke on some level has a very woke influence in their HR departments or their administration or their executive suite in some manner, because this appeasement has been going on for a while.
I know that we see the danger here, but I don't want to miss the blind spot, which is situations where, and I gave the example of the woman who, would rise in the ranks of a company, right? But let's say she was propositioned and she was heavily suggested to give a favor to her boss or whoever. She went to HR, she went through the correct channels, and they told her to shut up. This has happened. There are many, many cases over the years, much worse in the past. And just through the Me Too movement, we've seen this happening with, there's Matt Lauer. I mean, I could go on to Charlie Rose. Now, I don't know the details of every single case, but this does happen. And even when you respect the institution, it may fail you. So in those cases, do we need a bludgeon? Do we need the Me Too movement to break a few eggs? And I'm just throwing this out there.
So this is an interesting point. The way I read it, Jack, correct me if I'm wrong, you're almost saying sometimes is it appropriate to recognize, so like this woman, hypothetically, she's been sexually harassed. She has gone through the channels where she would say, hey, I'm making a good faith effort to improve my organization by trying to get them to take corrective action against sexual harassment, which will make it a better organization.
Exactly.
Clearly, she has a love and a respect for the organization. She hasn't let this one incident make her want to level it to the ground and burn it to the ground. But then when she tries to go through that process, this is a good.
Yeah.
I like this. You're kind of steel manning a little bit, so it's smart. So she goes through that process. It doesn't work. Like she just gets totally like, you know what, that guy, he's really high up. We got to just kind of let him do his thing. If you could just deal with it, if you could just twirl around or whatever he asks you to do, please. That was kind of how it was at Fox News, by the way. But
that's right.
Yeah, he would ask them to twirl. It's disgusting. But anyway, so that's an example. It's like, and then it sort of becomes, what do we do when I mean, that woman, you can kind of understand where that resentment comes from then, where she says like, well, fuck this place. I actually do want to level this place to the ground. Yeah. And that's an interesting point. So basically it's sort of like, at what point do you actually recognize that an institution is so rotten because one sexual harasser does not necessarily make an institution of, say, hundreds or thousands of employees rotten. But if the actual HR department is rotten too, like a full department that is specifically designed to protect its employees is also rotten, you could kind of make an argument then, like, actually, this whole thing does need to be fucking brought to the ground.
Yeah. All right, I'm going to present a really different take here, kind of out of my usual wheelhouse, but I'm going to go with it because it's an idea that I've been exploring a lot recently. A lot of people, like, we're human. I think a lot of people expect way too much of us. I say deal with it. Like, if it's bad enough, leave, and other people will leave too. But if it's not bad enough, then deal with it. Like, that's just, we deal with stuff all the time in our lives, and if we expect these like crazy, ridiculous purity tests, like, I mean, it seems like they're never ending, right? It's like, oh, I don't like the way that guy looks at me. You need to fire him. Mm-hmm. And it's like, how far does it go? Like, at some point, you just say like it wasn't that bad. Deal with it. If it's really bad, leave.
I like this point, Peter. And what I would say is, to an extent, that would totally be my attitude. Is like, if you say you worked in an environment where like, it's not like your direct supervisor, it's some other executive, like you're kind of new, you're a cute girl. There's like one old dude that like a couple times a week, he just makes some stupid joke about like, looking good today, Susan. I like that dress. He's just creepy. He's just fucking weird. Yeah. And he just says kind of gross stuff every once in a while. And like over the course of your first year or two, you learn that like he's not dangerous. He's never sexually assaulted you. It doesn't get to that point. You don't have to interact with him on a daily basis. That would be an important factor. Is like, this isn't somebody that you have to interact with on a every day, that you're working very closely with. He's not constantly accosting you, talking about how nice your ass looks, you know. If it's under a certain level, I agree with you. I agree that it's like, yeah, you know what? You live in a world where you're going to have to deal with shitty people. And if you value your job a lot, like if you love this job and this is the one bad, like if you love all your other coworkers, they're just amazing people. Like the men and the women are all wonderful. You love it. You love the industry. You love the company. There's just this one kind of creepy guy. Then like, yeah, it's kind of a point of like, you decide either this one thing is so bad that I'm going to leave, or you decide this one thing isn't that bad in the grand scheme of things, and I am just going to kind of deal with it. But then there is that point where if it gets above a certain level, like say this was your direct supervisor, and every fucking day this guy's like, hey, Susan, when are we going out to lunch? You know, like it just will not stop. Like I could totally see how it takes this thing where it puts you in a really bad position because you really want to have this job. Like the woman, I think the hypothetical woman we're talking about is somebody who loves her job and loves her company. You just have this one person, right, who's sexually harassing them. If it was something you had to deal with on a daily basis and it was really gross, like it was somebody who it's not, like it gets past a certain point where it's truly obscene and distracting, then it's like, I think you can't make that argument anymore. It's like, it's, you know
okay.
what I mean?
Yeah. No, but I would make the counterpoint. I would say there's a third alternative that you're ignoring. And what I fear here is the mob. I don't want the mob making these decisions, right? When you have your Twitter mob and it's just so easy to weaponize and there's no checks on it, right? I propose a third alternative. Find somebody else at the company and say, hey, can you help me deal with this guy? Or talk to the fucking guy yourself. Be like, no, that's not cool. Like make a scene out of it. Make a scene out, and if other people agree with you, they'll also reinforce your behavior. Like take personal responsibility or appeal to authority. And if the authority is the problem and there's no check on that authority, then it's a toxic place that you don't want to be in anyway, and get the fuck out. Like those are your options.
Or you can kind of organize the rank and file if there's enough people who have had the same problem.
Right.
You're saying
this is how problems are solved.
You're saying don't go straight to the Twitterati.
Don't go to the mob. I don't want the mob making these decisions.
And I agree 100%. That
personal responsibility.
You never go straight to the Twitterati. You never go straight to the media to cause a PR stink. Although I don't know, I think you can make the argument though that if there's institutional rot, maybe that is something the media needs to know. Because if you have an organization where the HR department is not protecting its employees at all from obscene sexual harassment, again, not like there's the one older executive who makes like kind of inappropriate comments every once in a while that are like borderline. That is within the realm of like fucking deal with it and go to work. Like this is life. But if it's really obscene and it's like on a regular basis and the HR isn't going to do anything about that, I think there's an argument to be made that like a responsible journalist should open an investigation And
Not the mob. That's not the
Not the
mob,
mob.
right? This is
but,
like,
but you know what the
find a
problem is? The
journalist-
media kind of is the mob now. Like
They
the responsible journalists to which I'm referring to does not fucking exist.
Right. So that's why I resist that.
I know.
Yeah, and the person that is
Solution.
being victimized, they have somewhat of a responsibility for the next person coming in. The next intern who's kind of ignorant, and
Yeah.
doesn't know what's happening. You want to
Yeah, post something on Facebook.
You
give
could-
them 1 star on Glassdoor. Like, there's just so many.
Yeah.
We have such there's so much in our society now that says go to authority, don't deal with it yourself. Go to the mob. Don't deal
Right.
with
There
it
is
yourself.
definitely a thing where
deal
like,
with
you,
it yourself.
You definitely should confront someone. Although, there's something to be said for like an intern isn't going to march into the CEO's office and be like, stop talking about my ass. Like that's just not a realistic expectation from like a 19-year-old, right? Like that's not. So like, and that's why in theory HR departments and ombudsmen exist, like is to shield that person. But yeah, I mean, if you're roughly equal to the person in seniority, you should definitely have a conversation with them. And there's a lot of people who will not do that.
Yeah.
Like in the exact situation, like, and with a relatively low level, I mean, let's bring it back kind of down to earth where it's like, oh, it's somebody who's roughly equal to you in seniority. They're just making these kind of gross jokes that are nothing truly obscene, but it bothers you. It annoys you. It's within the realm of annoyance where it's just like, shut the fuck up. You should have a conversation to be like, hey, Phil, I really don't appreciate it when you talk about my body or you talk about sex. Just stop fucking doing it. And odds are Phil's going to be like, oh, fuck. You know what I mean? He's going to be like, shit. Like, I'm going to get in trouble if I don't stop. And he's going to stop.
Yeah.
And if he doesn't, you go from there. But yeah, there's definitely a thing where people don't ever even attempt to reason with the person or as you said, instead they go straight to authority. They don't work it out amongst themselves. That I definitely agree that in all of these cases, there's a tendency to, even when it would be appropriate, again, you're roughly equal to the person in seniority. And so you're not really at risk of having that just because, yeah, again, like an intern cannot march into the CEO's office and do that.
Although the case of like Roger taking down Roger Ailes and Fox News.
Well, they
News
didn't
is
go to
still standing.
him.
They didn't.
Yeah.
That's true. But it was multiple women coming together.
Yeah, well, so that was kind of like what Peter was saying about how you would go to another colleague and be like, hey, if you had a problem with this guy where like he's kind of doing this thing, and like they'd be like, yeah. And then if you get, if you march into HR with 10 people, they're gonna have a very different reaction than when you march in by yourself. Get a little fucking creative is basically what I'm hearing from you, Peter. Is don't just immediately go to fucking Twitter, which is like the lamest way and the least effective way to do it.
Yeah, I don't want the mob making these types of decisions, but also, I mean, it disempowers the individual. Like I've seen women who have dealt with sexual harassment, I would say in very good and positive ways, even from people who are their supervisors or their supervisors, and they deal with it personally, and it turns out in every case it has turned out really, really well that I know about, right? And they become stronger people as a result, right? They're not dependent on some authority or some Twitter mob or whatever. And the person usually almost always stops doing what they were doing. And it's because embraced that personal responsibility, took some action, because it's in every aspect of your life, like you're not going to have that authority. You're not going to have that, that internet mob to go out and solve your problems for you. And you just end up being such a better person as a result. I don't see why that's not the default in a lot of these scenarios.
There's definitely, I think unfortunately, there's been a feedback loop, especially for young people in society, that the most effective way to deal with these things is to like make a big stink and get your professor in trouble with the media and to go to authority. I mean, this has been covered in Coddling of the American Mind, a book that we mention a lot, was like kids under a certain age have been taught to always go to it's like, tell the teacher, always tell the teacher, make sure the teacher knows. Like that was a big thing for me growing up. Is like, make sure the teacher knows, always tell the teacher, tell someone's mom, tell someone's dad, like never actually just talk to your fucking friend. And I eventually got to a point where I just unilaterally was like, I don't fucking like talking to the teacher. Like I'd rather just talk to my fucking friend. Like I just kind of learned on my own. Like, yeah, this works out a lot better when I just fucking talk to people.
Yeah, it's a terrible part of our culture is this deference to authority and using it as a bludgeon on everyone and anything, suing people and wanting to come up with new laws because they disagree with your lifestyle. It's rampant.
Well, I think we've had a pretty robust discussion today. So thanks for listening. This is Going Dark, an intellectual dark web podcast. We'll see you next time.